By the early 1950s, the high commands of the world's superpowers had reached a realization that was as chilling as it was absolute. The era of conventional warfare, as defined by the mud and grit of the Second World War, was over. The planners in the Pentagon and the Kremlin looked at the smoking ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and saw more than just the end of a conflict. They saw a terrifying new horizon. The next war, the one everyone feared but everyone prepared for, wouldn't be fought with bullets and bayonets alone. It would be fought under the shadow of the mushroom cloud. In the previous decade, armor had been the king of the battlefield. The Tiger, the T-34, and the Sherman had dictated the flow of history through raw steel and internal combustion. But nuclear weapons didn't just destroy cities, they rewrote the fundamental laws of physics on the front line. A single tactical nuclear strike could deliver a cocktail of destruction that no 20th century machine was prepared for. First came the thermal pulse, a flash of light hotter than the surface of the sun that could melt rubber seals, ignite fuel lines, and blind crews instantly. Then came the shock wave, a wall of overpressure moving at supersonic speeds that didn't just dent tanks, it flipped them over like toys, snapping the necks of the men inside. Following the wind was the initial radiation, a silent, invisible rain of neutrons and gamma rays that could penetrate several inches of steel. Finally, there was the electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, which would fry the rudimentary electrical systems of the time, and the black rain of radioactive fallout that would turn every inch of the landscape into a slow-acting poison. In this new reality, military planners faced a grim paradox. If a single bomb could wipe out an entire armored division in seconds, was the tank obsolete, or did the tank simply need to evolve into something else? Both superpowers began to obsess over the same question. What if a tank had to fight after the world had ended? What if the machine didn't just survive the blast, but actually thrived in the ruins of the apocalypse? The pursuit of that answer would lead Soviet engineers down a path of radical design, resulting in one of the strangest, most haunting armored vehicles ever to crawl across the Earth. To understand the machine that was about to be born, one must understand the Soviet mindset during the height of the Cold War. In Moscow, military doctrine wasn't built on the hope of avoiding nuclear war, it was built on the certainty of winning one. Soviet generals assumed that if a large-scale conflict broke out with NATO in the Fulda Gap or across the North German Plain, nuclear weapons would be used immediately. There would be no grace period of conventional fighting. This was the era of the tactical nuke, where even short-range artillery could lob atomic shells. In this vision of the future, there were no clean front lines, there were no safe rear areas for logistics or repairs, there was no time to regroup or wait for the radiation to clear. The Red Army's philosophy was deep battle, a relentless, high-speed advance that would overwhelm Western Europe before the United States could reinforce it. To make deep battle work in a nuclear environment, the Red Army needed more than just a tank. They needed a sealed, lead-lined fortress on tracks. The requirements handed down to the design bureaus were staggering. Armored units would be expected to advance through dead zones. They would have to drive directly through ground zero minutes after a detonation. Survive the hammer blow. They needed a shape that could withstand the literal atmospheric pressure of a nuclear blast without being overturned. Operate in total electronic silence. In an environment where EMP had fried the grid, the machine had to remain mechanical, brutal, and functional. The human factor. Most importantly, they had to keep the crew alive and fighting, while the very air around them was glowing with lethal isotopes. To Soviet engineers, this wasn't about making a better tank, it was about creating a post-apocalyptic predator. They weren't looking for incremental upgrades to the T-54 or the heavy IS-3, they were looking for a paradigm shift. They needed a vehicle that could stand at the center of a nightmare and not blink. In the secretive world of Soviet military research, Names were a luxury reserved for the public or for machines already in mass production. For the experimental prototypes, the black projects of the Soviet Union, there was only the object designation. This kept the design's purpose invisible to Western intelligence and wrapped the project in a layer of bureaucratic shadow. The task of building the nuclear survivable tank fell to the legendary OKB-2 Design Bureau at the Kirov plant in Leningrad. This was the same cradle that had produced the heavy tanks that broke the back of the Wehrmacht. But this new project, Object 279, was unlike anything they had ever attempted. The design requirements for Object 279 sounded like something out of a science fiction novel, yet they were driven by the cold, hard math of nuclear physics. The engineers were told to ignore traditional tank aesthetics and focus on one thing: survival at all costs. The shape of the future. The first thing anyone noticed about the hull of Object 279, it didn't look like a tank, it looked like a flying saucer or a prehistoric crustacean. The entire body was encased in a strange elliptical shield. This wasn't just for deflecting shells, though it was incredibly effective at that. The curved, aerodynamic shape was specifically engineered to allow the shock wave of a nuclear explosion to flow over and around the tank rather than hitting it like a flat wall. By minimizing surface area and eliminating flat edges, the tank could remain upright and stable while the wind of the blast tried to toss it into the air. The shield of lead and steel. The armor wasn't just thick, it was sophisticated. Object 279 featured a multi-layered casting process. In some areas, the effective thickness of the armor was over 300 millimeters, nearly impossible for any contemporary anti-tank gun to penetrate. But inside that steel was a secret: liners designed to stop neutron radiation, a threat that traditional armor couldn't handle. The four tracks nightmare. Perhaps the most bizarre feature was the suspension. While every other tank in the world used 2 tracks, Object 279 used 4. 2 sets of tracks were mounted on longitudinal beams under the center of the hull. This served 2 purposes. First, it lowered the ground pressure to such an extent that the 60-ton behemoth could glide over deep snow, thick mud, or the swampy terrain of a cratered battlefield that would swallow any other tank. Second, the 4 tracks made the tank nearly impossible to track or disable with mines. Even if it lost one, it had 3 more to keep it moving. The Iron Fist. Despite its defensive focus, Object 279 was designed to kill. It was armed with the 130mm M65 rifled gun, a massive cannon that could punch through the front of any NATO tank from miles away. It featured an assisted loading system to keep the rate of fire high as the crew struggled inside their cramped, lead-lined cocoon. No Western tank was designed for this. No American general was asking for a machine that could survive a near miss from a hydrogen bomb. But in the halls of the Kirov plant, the Soviet engineers weren't just building a weapon, they were building the ultimate insurance policy for the end of the world. To look at the hull of the Object 279 was to look at a masterclass in defensive geometry. In the early 1950s, tank design was still largely a game of thickness, slapping on more steel to stop more kinetic energy. But the engineers at the Kirov plant realized that against a nuclear detonation, raw thickness was a secondary concern. The real enemy was the overpressure wave, a wall of compressed air that could reach pressures of over several hundred pounds per square inch in a fraction of a second. A traditional tank, with its flat sides and vertical surfaces, acted like a sail. A nuclear blast would catch those flat plates and exert hundreds of tons of force, tumbling the 60-ton vehicle like a piece of driftwood in a hurricane. To survive, the Object 279 had to be aerodynamic, not for speed, but for survival. The result was a hull that defied every convention of Soviet armor. It featured a low, rounded, elliptical profile that looked less like a weapon of war and more like a river stone polished by centuries of water. Every curve was intentional. The engineers used a specialized casting process to create a shield that wrapped around the main armored core. This outer shell was designed to deflect the blast wave, allowing the supersonic air to flow smoothly over and around the vehicle, pinning it to the ground rather than lifting it up. But the protection didn't stop with the shape. The hull was sealed with the obsessive precision of a deep-sea submarine. In a world filled with radioactive dust and weaponized gases, a single leak was a death sentence. The Soviet designers treated the interior of the tank as a pressurized sanctuary. Every hatch was fitted with thick, layered gaskets made of specialized polymers designed to withstand the searing heat of the thermal pulse. Every joint where steel met steel was reinforced and double-welded. Even the gun mantlet, traditionally a weak point where the cannon enters the turret, was completely redesigned with a flexible armored collar to prevent the crushing pressure of a blast from forcing its way into the fighting compartment. This wasn't armor meant just for shells. This was armor designed to fight the very laws of physics. It was a machine built to stand at the heart of a man-made sun and remain unyielding. If the exterior of the Object 279 was a bunker, the interior was a life support system. For the 4 men assigned to this machine, the commander, driver, gunner, and loader, the experience of tanking was transformed into something closer to being an astronaut or a submariner. They didn't just sit inside the hull, they were enclosed in what was effectively a survival capsule. The psychological toll of nuclear warfare was something the Soviet High Command took very seriously. They knew that a crew would only fight if they felt safe from the invisible killers of the atomic age. To provide that safety, the interior was lined with specialized anti-radiation materials. In addition to the thick steel, the walls were coated with lead-impregnated liners and hydrogen-rich plastics designed to capture and slow down neutrons, the most piercing and lethal byproduct of a nuclear explosion. If a nuclear blast occurred in the vicinity, the Object 279 would enter a lockdown state. The process was almost biological in its reflex. Sensors would detect the initial flash of gamma radiation or the sudden spike in atmospheric pressure, and the tank would automatically seal itself off from the outside world. Heavy-duty solenoid valves would slam shut the air intakes. Massive lead-shielded shutters would drop over the optical ports. A sophisticated overpressure system would begin pumping filtered air into the cabin, creating a positive pressure environment. By keeping the air pressure inside slightly higher than the air outside, the tank ensured that even if there were a microscopic breach in a seal, the contaminated air and fallout would be pushed away from the crew rather than sucked in. For the minutes or perhaps hours following a strike, the crew would be plunged into a terrifying limbo. They would be blind, deaf to the outside world, and sealed inside a vibrating steel coffin as the shock waves roared past. They would have to rely entirely on their internal climate control to keep from suffocating in the heat trapped by the heavy armor. But they would be alive. While every other soldier on the battlefield was succumbing to radiation sickness or being crushed by the atmosphere, the crew of the 279 would be checking their gauges, clearing their sights, and preparing to counterattack. In the 1950s, the world was beginning its love affair with electronics. Vacuum tubes and early transistors were finding their way into fire control systems, radios, and engine regulators. But the Soviet engineers working on the Object program were skeptics. They understood a fundamental truth of the nuclear age that many in the West were slow to grasp: the electromagnetic pulse. In an instant, modern electronics are fried, leaving sophisticated machines as nothing more than expensive scrap metal. The Soviet solution was as brutal as it was effective. They designed the Object 279 to be an analog warrior. The engineers assumed that from the moment the first bomb fell, every circuit in the tank would be dead. Therefore, the tank had to be capable of fighting in total electronic silence. There were no digital displays, no computerized range finders, no electronic fuel injection. Instead, the tank was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. Manual controls. If the power traverse for the turret failed, the gunner had a series of heavy-duty hand cranks and gears that allowed him to rotate the massive 130mm gun with pure muscle. Mechanical sights. The optics were hardened using thick lead glass prisms and manual stadiometric scales. They didn't need a laser to find the range, they needed a trained eye and a steady hand. Analog backups. Every critical system, from the oil pressure to the fuel levels, was monitored by physical, needle and spring gauges. Mechanical heart. The massive 1,000 horsepower diesel engine was designed to be started and operated through purely mechanical linkages. This philosophy created a machine that was undeniably crude compared to the high-tech prototypes being developed in the United States at the time. It was loud, it was heavy, and it required immense physical strength to operate. But it possessed a quality that the Soviets valued above all else: absolute reliability. In the chaotic, terrifying aftermath of an atomic exchange, where the sky is black with soot and the radio waves are nothing but static, the Object 279 wouldn't care that the world's power grids had collapsed. It didn't need a computer to tell it where to aim. It was a clockwork monster, a mechanical beast of burden that would continue to move, aim, and fire as long as there was a man inside to pull the levers. If the exterior of the Object 279 was a bunker, the interior was a capsule. The Soviet designers abandoned conventional waste planning. Instead of cramming shells into odd corners and racks, like in a backpacker filled with oversized books, they designed the ammunition to be part of the very structure of the tank. Every 130mm round was encased in a specialized cylindrical casting, more like a can of good quality coffee than a traditional shell casing. These cans were not just storage containers, they were shields. Each can was lined with specialized radiation-absorbing materials, much like the lead aprons used in X-ray rooms. If a nuclear blast occurred, this design meant that every single round would independently contain a small part of the detonation, preventing a chain reaction within the ammunition store. If the exterior of the Object 279 was a bunker, the interior was a capsule. The Soviet designers abandoned conventional waste planning. Instead of cramming shells into odd corners and racks, like in a backpacker filled with oversized books, they designed the ammunition to be part of the very structure of the tank. Every 130mm round was encased in a specialized cylindrical casting, more like a can of good quality coffee than a traditional shell casing. These cans were not just storage containers, they were shields. Each can was lined with specialized radiation-absorbing materials, much like the lead aprons used in X-ray rooms. If a nuclear blast occurred, this design meant that every single round would independently contain a small part of the detonation, preventing a chain reaction within the ammunition store. If the exterior of the Object 279 was a bunker, the interior was a capsule. The Soviet designers abandoned conventional waste planning. Instead of cramming shells into odd corners and racks, like in a backpacker filled with oversized books, they designed the ammunition to be part of the very structure of the tank. Every 130mm round was encased in a specialized cylindrical casting, more like a can of good quality coffee than a traditional shell casing. These cans were not just storage containers, they were shields. Each can was lined with specialized radiation-absorbing materials, much like the lead aprons used in X-ray rooms. If a nuclear blast occurred, this design meant that every single round would independently contain a small part of the detonation, preventing a chain reaction within the ammunition store. If the exterior of the Object 279 was a bunker, the interior was a capsule. The Soviet designers abandoned conventional waste planning. Instead of cramming shells into odd corners and racks, like in a backpacker filled with oversized books, they designed the ammunition to be part of the very structure of the tank. Every 130-millimeter round was encased in a special. In testing, this four-tracked nightmare proved it could go where no other vehicle could follow. It could traverse deep, powdery snow without sinking. It could crawl through swampy marshlands that would swamp a T-54 in seconds. Most importantly, it could climb over the jagged dragon's teeth and anti-tank obstacles of the era by simply straddling them. But there was a tactical reason for the four tracks as well. In the 1950s, the most common way to stop a tank was to track it, using a mine or a rocket to break the chain, leaving the vehicle a sitting duck. With four tracks, the Object 279 was almost impossible to immobilize. Even if a mine blew apart one track, the tank still had three others operational. It could limp out of the kill zone or continue its advance, an unstoppable juggernaut that refused to be anchored. However, this mechanical complexity came at a price. The four-track system was a maintenance nightmare. To change an inner track, mechanics would have to practically disassemble the entire underside of the tank. It was a design built for the final battle of humanity, a battle where maintenance was a secondary concern to momentum. A tank that survives a nuclear blast is useless if it cannot strike back. The Soviets knew that any NATO forces surviving the initial exchange would likely be entrenched in heavy fortifications or operating their own heavy armor, like the American M103 or the British Conqueror. To ensure the Object 279 could win any duel, they armed it with the M65 130mm rifled gun. This wasn't just a tank gun, it was a modified naval cannon. At the time, it was one of the most powerful anti-tank weapons ever fitted to a mobile chassis. The M65 fired a massive 70-pound shell with a muzzle velocity that could punch through nearly 300 millimeters of armor at a distance of 1,000 meters. To handle the immense recoil and the weight of the ammunition, the turret was equipped with a semi-automatic loading system. This allowed the four-man crew to maintain a rate of fire of 5 to 7 rounds per minute, a terrifying prospect for any NATO commander. The gun was also fitted with a sophisticated, for the time, two-plane stabilizer and a grooved muzzle brake to dissipate the massive pressure of the firing. When the M65 spoke, it didn't just hit a target, it obliterated it. The Soviets envisioned the Object 279 sitting on a ridge silhouetted against the glow of a distant mushroom cloud, picking off Western tanks from miles away before they even knew they were in a fight. In 1957, the first functional prototype of the Object 279 rolled out of the Kirov plant. It was a surreal sight, a gleaming, saucer-shaped titan perched atop its four tracks, its long cannon stretching out like the stinger of a prehistoric insect. The testing phase was brutal. The Soviets took the 279 to the most inhospitable proving grounds they could find. They drove it through the frozen wastes of the north, through the deep mud of the spring Rasputitsa, and across obstacle courses designed to break the suspension of any lesser machine. The results were astonishing. The tank was fast, reaching speeds of 55 kilometers per hour on open ground. Its four-track system allowed it to turn on a dime and climb slopes that were considered impassable. In live fire exercises, the 130mm gun proved to be a sniper's tool, hitting targets with devastating precision. But the most important tests were the ones that didn't involve driving. Engineers subjected the hull to extreme pressure tests, simulating the shock waves of a nuclear blast. They tested the seals with chemical simulants. They checked the radiation lining with live isotopes. On paper, the Object 279 was the perfect weapon. It was the ultimate survivor. It was the tank that would lead the Red Army through the ashes of Europe to the Atlantic coast. It was the apex predator of the Cold War. And yet, despite its brilliance and its terrifying potential, only one was ever fully completed. The Object 279 was a victim of a change in leadership and a shift in technology. By the late 1950s, Nikita Khrushchev had taken the reins of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev was a man who believed in the future, and to him, the future wasn't heavy tanks. He was obsessed with missiles. Khrushchev famously hated the steel monsters of the previous generation. He saw heavy tanks as slow, expensive, and obsolete in an age where a cheap, guided anti-tank missile could destroy a multi-million-ruble tank from 3 miles away. He issued a decree: no Soviet tank would weigh more than 37 tons. The Object 279 was dead in the water. Furthermore, the very nature of tank warfare was changing. The concept of the main battle tank, or MBT, was emerging. Machines like the T-64 were being designed, tanks that had the armor of a heavy tank and the speed of a medium tank, but without the insane complexity of 4 tracks and a saucer-shaped hull. The Object 279 was too specialized, too expensive, and too difficult to maintain. It was a machine built for a very specific nightmare, a total nuclear war that thankfully never came. Today, if you travel to the Kubinka Tank Museum outside of Moscow, you can find the only surviving Object 279. It sits in a hangar surrounded by more famous machines like the T-34 and the IS-3. Even today, it looks like it belongs in another century. Visitors often stop and stare at its alien hull and its strange 4-track base, wondering what kind of madness could have birthed such a design. But the Object 279 isn't just a museum piece. It is a monument to a time when the world stood on the brink of the abyss. It is a reminder of the lengths to which humanity will go when faced with its own extinction, the engineering of survival in a world where the sun has fallen to Earth. It remains the most specialized armored vehicle ever built. It was a tank that didn't just fight other tanks, it was a tank built to fight the end of the world. And in its strange, lonely existence, it tells the story of an era where the impossible was the only thing that could keep you alive.